Welcome to On the Brink, a fresh lens to take you and your business to new heights. Hi, I'm Andi Simon, your hostess, and my job is to help you, as I tell you each time, to see, feel, and think in new ways. The whole idea is to step back, a little like an anthropologist, and get some perspective from the other side. You really need time now during these fast changing times to think about who you are and what you're doing through a fresh lens. And so I go looking for people who are going to help you do just that. So today I have Todd Cherches with us today. And Todd is the CEO and co-founder of Big Blue Gumball. This is a New York-based consulting firm. It specializes in leadership development, public speaking, and executive coaching. And what I'm so excited about is that Todd has a new book. It's called Visual Leadership, Leveraging the Power of Visual Thinking in Leadership and Life. He's also a TEDx speaker with the power of visual thinking and an award-winning adjunct professor of leadership at the Human Capital Management Master's Program at NYU. And being New York-based, the two of us are experiencing COVID-19 in some abundance. And we are doing a lot of virtual educating others about how do you lead in changing times. So Todd, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Andi. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed your book, which I keep right nearby and refer to. And I love your anthropological perspective on everything because we do connect. It's all about seeing things through the lens, the lens through which we see the world. So we have a lot of commonalities.
Tell us about your own journey, though. I like the listeners to, if they're not seeing you, and we're doing some more video now, but if they're only listening, they don't know Todd, and it's important for them to get a visualization, to your point, of who is Todd and why am I listening to you? Why is that important?
All right, great. Yeah, so I'll take you back to the beginning. I talk about it actually in my TEDx talk on the power of visual thinking, how as a kid, my dream was to be Superman. I always wanted to be Superman, but my backup position, because it's important to have a backup plan, was to be Batman. So those are my two career aspirations. And what's interesting is a client recently pointed out to me, in a way, you're kind of like a little bit of each, Superman and Batman. You have super speed and super strength, and instead of X-ray vision, you have the power of visual thinking as your superpower. And Batman, I have this utility belt of all these tools, tips, and techniques that I pull out at a moment's notice to help rescue my clients. So it's kind of in that way, I have that Superman, Batman thing happening, even though I'm not 8 years old anymore. So, but anyway, so yeah, so my dream was to work in the TV industry because I was obsessed with both books and reading, but also television. So I went to school, I got my bachelor's degree in English literature, made with a concentration in Shakespeare and poetry. What's interesting is because I work in management and leadership, most people assume I have a business degree when it is not. It's really a humanities degree. But I love, it gives me a different perspective. I do a lot of work around storytelling. That's a big part of being in the humanities and the business world, right? Every story has a beginning, middle, and end. We're all the star, the lead, the protagonist in our own story, right? We have obstacles to overcome. There's always victim, villains, and heroes, right? So I always look at things through the lens of storytelling, both in terms of literature and television. So I graduated from SUNY Albany, State University of New York at Albany, with a bachelor's degree in English, a master's in communication, with the goal of working in television. The only jobs in TV at that time in the mid-'80s were in advertising because most production was done out in Hollywood. So I worked for Ogilvy and Mather Advertising with my first job out of college. Great experience, but it was very much a numbers job. It was all about calculating ratings and shares and dollars for ad revenue. It wasn't creative, and I wanted to work in the creative capacity. So I packed my bags and my cape, as I say in my TED Talk, and flew out to Hollywood. And so I was out there with, I had 3 college roommates had moved out, or 2 college roommates and 1 new friend I had made, all from New York. So all the New Yorkers hung out together in LA. And so I did a lot of temp jobs. I even was a bouncer in a nightclub at night. That was a whole other story. I'm 6'4", but not a tough guy. So picture like a bookworm nerd being a bouncer at a nightclub. So,
With a little Shakespeare thrown in.
Yeah. Get thee out of here, right? When I was kicking people out of the nightclub. So it's interesting. It kind of pushed me as an introvert way out of my comfort zone, right? But you give someone a suit, a clipboard, and a velvet rope, and it changes your whole persona. So, but it's actually an interesting study in power dynamics, right? About how when you dress people up for the part and give them the equipment, sometimes it could go to your head, as we're seeing, with some of the controversy going out right now, right? So anyway, so I got a few internships and temp jobs. I worked for Michael Nesmith of the Monkees all the baby boomers know him. My millennial students have no idea who the Monkees are or who Michael Nesmith was. And then I worked for Aaron Spelling on Dynasty, just putting scripts together. But again, it was amazing to be at the TV studios out in Hollywood. And then I was in casting administration, doing contracts at Columbia Pictures Television. And then the writer's strike hit. And then I ended up getting into the temp pool at Disney through a friend of mine. And so I temped in 8 different departments over 8 weeks at Disney. So I was in PR 1 week, finance another week, marketing. 1 week I was out in the Disney warehouse packing Mickeys and Dumbos into boxes and driving a forklift. So really interesting experiences. But when, like musical chairs, when the strike ended, I ended up working for a writer-producer in TV comedy, which was an amazing experience, and I loved it. But then his development deal ended, and I got laid off. So I got a job at CBS in TV program development and drama program development. Great experience for about a week until my psycho boss's personality really started to emerge. And I write about that in my book. She's the boss who threw a box of pens at my head because they were the wrong ones. So that there was a lot of Harvey Weinstein type stuff happening. A lot of Hollywood's very much in some ways like Wall Street is or used to be, about ego, power, control, and money, right? So that wasn't really consistent with my core values. So I left television and got into the theme park business through a friend. The same friend who got me into Disney was now in the theme park company. And I got a job as a project manager. And I talk about this in my TED Talk, the project I managed in China, in which I couldn't speak the language, so I started drawing. So that's one of the key ahas of my visual thinking, was through drawing and pointing, basically playing Pictionary and charades, we were communicating with each other across language and cultural barriers. So I'll stop there for a second, but so that leads me up to my 10 years in LA before I moved back to New York and got into management leadership training, which I could talk about in a second.
But share, I mean, in your book, you do talk about your Pictionary story.
Yeah.
And it's give it a little more flesh, because I do think when you read it, you go, oh man, but it also asks us, do we really have to speak to each other? Do we really understand the words? Or is a picture more powerful?
Yeah. Well, that's saying the picture is 1,000 words is meaningful for a reason. And pictures cross cultural barriers, right? You're both looking at something. And when I talk about visual thinking in my book and in my TED Talk, I break it down to 3 words: attention, comprehension, and retention. When we use visual imagery and visual language, and I'll talk about some of the other visual techniques, but when you use pictures, it captures people's attention. It gets them to focus because you're looking at something through your eyes, not just hearing it through your ears. So that's the attention piece. Comprehension, we just understand better. If I'm just explaining how to get to where you are, you make a left here, you make a right here. But if you look at a map, you visually picture a map in your head, you have that picture, right? So maps are a great example. So that increases understanding. And in terms of retention, just recall and memory. Pictures stick, it's called dual coding theory, that we're using both parts of our brain, left brain and right brain, and that information is getting embedded in a way that just using the text part of our brain wouldn't. So in terms of that China story, long story short, we made robotic animal figures, this theme park company I was working for cultural theme parks around the world, and I was put in charge of this project in China. And at that time, I had never been out of the country before, didn't have a passport, and I was terrified of flying, terrified of being that far from home. So in some ways, I almost tried to get out of it, and I just kind of forced myself to do it. And it was a life-changing, transformative experience. So I'm really glad that I did not chicken out and that I did do it. But when I got there, they shipped the robotic animals. They were picture life-size elephants, sheep, and cows that were mechanical. So all the parts moved, the elephants' trumpets blew water and sprayed, and then the tails wagged and everything. They got there in shipping containers. So it was me and 2 technical guys, an engineer and a mechanical guy, and then all of the Chinese people. And this was Shenzhen in 1992, when it was just a special economic zone. So it was agricultural, industrial, but it was not the tech hub that it is today, which is hard to believe how far it's come. So basically, no one there no one spoke English at all. In fact, none of them had ever seen a Caucasian before. So they were just staring at me and taking pictures like I was out of they were pointing at me saying, "Stallone, Stallone." And I'm like, what does that mean, hello in China? And someone said to me, no, they think you're Sylvester Stallone.
You almost were another blow-up machine there.
Yes. So I'm 6'4" and he's only like 5'5". So there's a little bit of a height differential, but they saw me and saw Rocky for some reason, or Rambo. So anyway, so what happened was we were just kind of figuring out, how do we communicate what needs to happen? We need to unload the elephants and the sheep and the cows. We need to install them. We needed tools. So I started sketching things out. First it started with pointing, you go there, come with me. And then when we got the toolbox, which they brought over on a bicycle, because again, very low tech. But then if we needed a hammer, a screwdriver, or a nail, I basically took out a pad and piece of paper and I drew it. And even though I'm not a great artist, I was good enough to represent, and I'd say, this is what we need. And then they're, oh, okay, and then they would get it. And that's how we communicated, through pointing and pictures. And that was like a light bulb went off in terms of, hey, it's not just spoken words. We communicate in a lot of other ways. And that was kind of the foundation of my visual leadership and visual thinking approach, combined with my years in literature and my years in the television industry, which is a visual medium.
We know that the way the brain works is it takes information and data and creates a visual story of it, a movie set. And once you have that, by the time you're 30, you've got your perception of reality pretty well formed in that story, and you only see the things that conform to it. And so it makes it very interesting as you think about visual leadership. When you understand that, how does a leader use that wisdom, the way the brain is operating, to inspire people to get something done? And I'll use leadership. Management, someone said to me not long ago, you light a fire under their feet. Leadership, you inspire their hearts.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure what version of leadership you're thinking about, but using the visualization part, it changes the conversation from please do this to, or you must do this to, how do we tell a story about doing this? How do you really see? What is it that you want me to do? I hear what you say, but I'm not sure I understand it. So how did we build up on this visual leadership? Share with us.
Sure. Yeah, one of the phrases that I use, similar to what you just talked about, is you can either light a fire under someone or light a fire within them. Yes. And that's the distinction. So managers try to get things done through compliance and sometimes through carrot and stick kind of thing. Leaders are more inspirational. They build willing commitment and cooperation. I spent a lot of time in my workshops and in my NYU and Columbia classes distinguishing, using the John Kotter as the foundation. John Kotter from Harvard Business School does an amazing job of differentiating between management and leadership, not as positions or titles, but as functions, right? Mm-hmm. There's a saying, you manage the process, you lead the people, right? So when you're dealing with schedules and budgets and all of the nuts and bolts things about that relate to task and execution, those are management functions. When you're dealing with the strategic, the big picture, and the people side of things, those are all leadership functions. And to be successful, we need both, right? Mm-hmm. Management without leadership, there's no vision. Leadership without management, there's no execution. So it's like the yin and yang, right brain, left brain, however you want to divide it up. You need both to be successful. So I always ask people to think about, which side are you better at? Which side do you tend to gravitate towards? And that's where you need to kind of balance yourself out with someone else, maybe. If you're a strong leader, a visionary leader, you need someone to help make this plan a reality. And the flip side of that is you may be good at getting stuff done, but management without leadership, leads to stagnation. You turn around 3 to 5 years later and you haven't gotten anywhere beyond that. So the way visual leadership, and if you notice the word visual leadership as I spell it, both in my book, and it's actually a registered trademark now. I got the trademark patent on the word visual leadership. Vision and leadership are inseparable. Just like you're talking about, the lens through which we see the world, our paradigm, is basically based on our, as you know, as an anthropologist, based on culture, upbringing, what we're taught. And it's very hard to see beyond that, right? It's like the lens, it's like my glasses are the lens through which I see the world. Yep. That's a great visual metaphor for that. Sometimes we need to put on rose-colored glasses or sunglasses, right? By seeing things through a different lens. Sometimes we need a magnifying glass. So a great analogy that I love relating to seeing and vision is managers use a magnifying glass, leaders use a telescope. Uh-huh. Right? So if you think about that, managing, you're thinking about details, you're putting your head down and getting stuff done. Leaders need to be looking out far and wide into the future, beyond the horizon, right? And again, we're talking about functions, not people, right? But I think that's a great metaphor for lenses and seeing and what we notice and what we don't see. Yes. I don't know if you're familiar with Joel Barker, the futurist, who wrote the book Paradigms, one of my all-time favorite books, but he took the principle of paradigms from Thomas Kuhn's Scientific Revolutions and applied it to the world of business. And I love many of his principles, which are, our paradigms help us see certain things, but they also keep us from seeing certain things, right? Yeah.
Well, and part of this is the way the brain works.
Yeah.
It is the amygdala hijacks new things that upset the paradigm. It is, and to some degree, we have to remember that we decide with the heart and the gut. There are long neurons that go from the brain into the gut and how it feels. And there are more nerves coming from your eye to your brain than
Yeah.
anything, so how you see. And it's also a very important part of the human evolution where the stories that we share, you mentioned stories, and stories are a visualization. And the secret to our success is all through the stories that we retained, what we shared, and how we pulled them forward and shared them with the next generation and how they changed it. Even our brains changed as we told it.
Yeah.
But as you're working in leadership, are you finding that people understand this? Because I have a leadership academy that I'm running for 2 clients. And the first thing we do at the beginning is to visualize how they want to become leaders. And they aren't quite sure what the word means.
Uh-huh.
And they aren't quite sure how to tell us a story about how they will lead. I mean, all
Yeah.
the things you're talking about aren't necessarily intuitive. Sometimes you have an intuitive leader. They just know how to rally people and get them where they're going. But most of the folks are emerging, aspiring, and asked to become. And it's sort of this vacuum. It's almost a fog. And part of the beginning is a story. So how are you using it with your leadership development? I think it's great.
Yeah, I do a number of exercises which help people get to the root of what it means to be a leader. And what's great and interesting, but also problematic sometimes, is there's no one definition, right? There's a lot of definitions of what leadership is, what leadership qualities, traits, or characteristics are most effective, right? And it really is situational in this situational leadership, right? So we need to adapt our leadership style and approach to different situations. But one exercise I do with people is, well, one is I'll say, all right, you're in the schoolyard, you're in the playground, and you see a little kid, 5 years old, and someone points to that kid and says, see that little kid over there, boy or girl? That kid's going to be a real leader someday. And I say, what is it that that kid is doing, saying, being that makes you say that? And so from that, we pluck out a variety of different characteristics. And it could be anything because we're not actually seeing the kid. So that what you identify has to do with your storytelling, right? So
Yes.
someone will say, that kid is telling others what to do. That kid is creating followership. That kid has charisma, right? So it's what those types of things. So right there, we're identifying 10 or 20 characteristics of leaders based on a 5-year-old, right? Then another exercise I have people do is I have a list of 10 questions. One is, from my mother, I learned that leaders are blank. From my father, I learned that leaders are blank. And I take them chronologically through each year of from elementary school through high school through college. From my first manager, I learned that leaders are blank. And then you come up with 10 keywords, and then you have to pick 2 or 3 of them and tell us the story behind why you said that, right?
Yep.
So if I said, from my father, I learned that leaders are honest and have integrity, right?
Mhm.
I would say, well, what made you say that? Well, one time with my father, blah, 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 real life story. My father took me to a diner when I was like 7 years old. By myself, just me and him. And the waitress had given us $10 too much change. And we didn't realize that till we got to the parking lot. So I was like, cool, let's go to Carvel, free ice cream, right? But my father said, no, we have to go back in and give her the money back. It was an honest mistake. That's just the right thing to do. So we went back in, and my father said to the waitress, and he always liked to play around with people. He was an extreme extrovert, as opposed to me, the extreme introvert. So he said to the waitress, excuse me, I think you gave us the wrong change. And she said, no, I didn't. I never make a mistake, blah, blah, blah. And my father said, well, I thought you gave us $10 too much. And then she all of a sudden was like, oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you so much. And so my first reaction was she doesn't deserve it because she was so rude. But my father said, it was just the right thing to do. It was her money. And yes, so she learned a lesson, hopefully. Right. So right there, that was a teachable moment in real time about leadership. And side note, my father was an IRS agent for 35 years. So I don't know if that has anything to do with his integrity and his being a stickler for rules. But what right there, you know a little, just up from that one incident, you have a little bit about my father and a little bit about me from that one story. So it's through these stories that we tell and that we remember that shape our stories shape our values, our life experiences shape our values, and our values influence how we behave and how we lead. So I think that's a long way of saying that that's how we become the leaders that we are, both good and bad, right? Based on the stories we tell ourselves and the experiences that we've had.
We're sort of migrating into it. Tell us a little bit about what you are sharing in the book, because you've built the book in a very clever, creative, visual way,
Thank you.
and it's very a good book to read for the listeners. It's well worth, it is not an academic book, and it's not a prescriptive book. It's an exploration about visualizing and leadership that can be very helpful for you. Tell us about how the book came together and what it has inside.
Sure. First thing, I started keeping right, making notes like years ago. As I was teaching leadership courses and workshops, I would jot things down, and I would see models that didn't resonate with me, but instead of just discounting them, I redesigned them. So I created a lot of my own models. And then as I incorporated them into my workshops, people would always say, oh, you need to write a book. One of these days you need to write a book. So I heard that so often that, and it was always when I write my book, when I write my book. And then someone said to me, a friend of mine said, until you get a deadline, you're never going to do it. So you somehow need to, whether you self-publish or whatever, get yourself a deadline. Because it was always one of these days, right? So I went to a leadership conference. I met this guy, Rob Salafia, who wrote a great book called Leading from Your Best Self. In fact, it's one of the orange books right behind me.
Uh-huh.
And he introduced me to his agent, Ken Lazat, up in Boston. And even though he was a Red Sox fan and I'm a Yankees fan, I said, maybe we could work together. And he did. He signed me on as a client. We pitched it to all the publishers, and Post Hill Press, Simon & Schuster, said, let's do it. So so right there was a little bit. And then once I had that deadline I literally had 9 months to get them a first draft. There was no more one of these days. It was literally, so last summer, I literally had no summer of 2019. I locked myself away in this office that you're seeing right here and just wrote morning, noon, not morning, because I'm not a morning person, but noon to like 4 or 5 in the morning, 12 or 18-hour days. And I finally got the draft out, and it came out great. I was very happy with it. The hardest part was to decide what to leave out, because I probably had enough content for 2,000 pages, and this book is a little over 300. And the way it's structured, first I define what visual leadership is and why visuals. We talked a little bit about that just now, about how our brains are wired and the power of visuals. And then I break it down into visual, leading through visual, through mental models, leading through metaphor, and leading through storytelling. And I talk a little bit about the future of leadership and how we can apply visual leadership to help us see, envision, and to create a better future.
Well, is there each of the chapters ends with something you can do.
Yes.
And are there a couple that you find particularly useful as you're helping people understand both the visual part of it, but also deal with problems or opportunities that they have to address?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so each chapter ends with the big lesson. So here was my key takeaway, why I wrote it. Then the big question, it poses a thought-provoking question. So basically, based on my story, how could you use this? What did you take away? And then it leaves blank spaces for your big insight and your big action. I always talk in terms of insights, actions, and outcomes. Whenever I do a class or a workshop, I always say, insights, actions, and outcomes. Insight, I always have a visual of an ant carrying a gigantic leaf,
Yes.
a gigantic leaf. So what are you taking away with you? What's that big idea that you're taking away?
Yes.
Action is a flying frog, which is basically taking that leap. So insight is what did you learn? Action is what are you going to do with what you learned? And outcome is looking forward, again, thinking visually, what will change? What will be better? What will be improved? What will happen if you implement this insight that you just had? So that's the way each chapter is structured. So again, it's filled with about 75 of my favorite stories of horrible bosses, a few good ones, the mental models that I created, and then a lot of metaphors. For example, one being, I posed the question, what is your leadership weather report, right? So picture you're watching Al Roker on the Today Show, he's doing the news, the weather, right? What's your weather report? So I ask, when you walk into a room, back when we walked into actual rooms as opposed to Zoom rooms, but it actually applies online just as well. Are you a ray of sunshine, or are you a cloud of doom and gloom with thunder and lightning following you around? Because we all know there's some bosses, some people, it's not even about your role, it's really about your energy. Some people walk in and the party starts and everyone's energized and excited, and sometimes someone walks into the room and it's like, everything freezes over, and it's like people put their head down and are scared.
Stay out of harm's way. I know.
Yeah. So I say, as a leader, what's your weather report? You create the culture and the climate around you. So what is your impact on other people? So just to getting people to think that way. And again, we all have our rainy days, our gray skies, but like my boss at CBS, the one who threw that box of pens at my head, I'd say to her, good morning, I won't say her real name. I'll say, good morning. She'll say, what's good at it? Another day in this hellhole. So it's like, if that's your boss's attitude when she walks in the morning, how do you think the rest of your day is going to go? Not too great. So that was an indicator of the
Well,
climate I work.
the one that I held on to because it comes up often, and it's in the future when trying to communicate in a situation where words may not do alone. Think about how you can leverage the power of drawing to conceptualize your idea and effective way of communicating it to others. And as the listeners are listening, we really mean draw it.
Yeah.
I have my folks do storyboards, and I often have them as they're visualizing who they want to become, whether as a leader or as a parent, to put it up in a place where they can see it often. And then as we're working through the period of time we're working together, they'll often refer back to it. In my picture, I said this. I showed you that. In the story I shared, even the ability to share a story isn't comfortable often, but when you draw it, all of a sudden I can hold it up and show it to you.
Yeah.
And then from that, you have what's the big question? And really, what's the insight? What's your action? And it's all mapped out for us so that we don't have to figure it out. It's there to help us.
Yeah. Just an example of that, when you asked me to tell you a little bit about my career background, I had in front of me, reveal, this is my visual bio. So this is my entire resume in a visual timeline. So you could see from my college internship at NBC through Ogilvy and Mather and et cetera, all the way up to the present. So this was my little cheat sheet. So as I'm telling stories, I see that Disney logo, that will trigger 20 different stories of when I worked at Disney, right? Just seeing that logo there. So that's a great example of the power. Why do children's books have pictures in them, or even pop-up books, right? Even better. How much do we all love a pop-up? When was the last time I think someone said that to me, you should make your next book a pop-up, a leadership pop-up book. I think that would be really fun.
Well, you could actually do that without much difficulty.
Yeah.
Your current book could use an add-on. The opportunity, though, is that everything is three-dimensional today. It's no longer about a book per se. It's all experiential learning. And when we work with clients, it's all experiential, all active learning. And your questions are relevant, but giving them the tool to realize how they will learn through active learning and then talking about it, reflecting on it, getting echoes back from each other. It's a social event. It's very interesting.
Yeah, here's a real life example of that. I was doing a team building workshop, and one of the things that they found was when business development people were going out to clients, they were all telling different stories about what the company did and how it did
Don't you love that?
Yeah.
The same.
So what we did was there were 20-something people in the room. We put up 20-something flip charts on the walls and with markers and said, draw out in an image or a metaphor how you would explain who we are and what we do. And then each person had to present it back in under 5 minutes. What was amazing is everyone was telling a completely different story. In fact, some of them were so inaccurate, they weren't even true. So it wasn't even like, oh, you weren't using the best one. It was like you're using a wrong one. So imagine a salesperson, business development, literally saying the wrong things to a client. So what they did is they took all those stories and came up with like 3 approved metaphors and also everyone in that room gained clarity on, oh, I didn't know we did that, or I didn't know that's what we were supposed to say. So that was really amazing aha for everyone. And that was a great example of, and even if you can't draw, and I always, this is one of the classic things, you ask a group of kindergartners how many of you can draw, they all raise their hand. You ask a group of business people, a couple raise their hand, right? So over the 30 or 40 or 50 years, have we lost our ability to draw or our confidence? It's probably our confidence, or it's just not on our radar to pick up a marker and get up at a whiteboard, a flip chart, a tablet, a napkin, right? Doing napkin sketching. So even if you could draw a stick figure, you can map something out, right? An organizational chart is basically like a drawing of who reports to who in your company, right? So when you say this person reports to this person, it's just, again, it's visual representation of reality so you could see it more clearly. My first TEDx talk was called The Power of Visual Thinking. I got approved to do a second one, but it was canceled because of COVID, so hopefully it will be rescheduled. But it was called The Magic of Mental Models. And it's all about how by thinking inside the box, we could then think better when we take it outside the box, right? So, because life is messy and complex, but if we could simplify complexity by putting something within a framework that enables us to see it more clearly, then we could see solutions that didn't occur to us otherwise, and then we could then take it out of the box and do it in real life.
I want to add a thought to your thoughts, and then we're about ready to wrap, because one of the things I often preach is that if you don't tell a story to your folks, they will make one up.
Yeah.
They will never say, I don't really know.
Right.
And they are very creative. And what comes out of it is exactly your experience with 15 or 20 different stories.
Yeah.
The other thing that I often preach from a leadership perspective, and it's very appropriate, is that leaders have to over determine success by talking and talking and talking and talking. If they don't keep telling the same story over and over, people are making one up and they're not quite sure what the words meant. They're never going to say, I don't really know what you want us to do.
Yeah.
They do it up and they make it up on their own. And so this communication, whether it's virtual, whether it's remote workforce or whatever it is, do not think that they heard you and do not think they know what it meant. But they will never say to you, I don't think I know what you mean, because a good follower was going to make up a good story for you.
Yeah.
And then you'll see everybody doing 10 different things like your various folks were doing.
Yeah, yeah. If
As
someone
we
goes
wrap
to a
up,
movie and say, tell me what that movie was about, 20 people are going to tell you 20 different
oh, I
descriptions
know.
of what the movie was about, right? So that happens in real life just as well.
Well, and when we take clients out to do anthropology with their clients, we'll walk out of the same factory or meeting, write down what we heard, and we have completely different hearing.
Yeah.
And they're trying to fit it into the box, and I'm looking for all the gaps. We just are, it's fascinating.
Yes, yes.
A couple of things, Todd, you want them to remember as we wrap up, because you know they often remember the ending.
Yeah, sure, sure. Yes, we do. It's the primacy and recency effect, right? We remember the first thing we hear and the last thing we hear, right? So, so a couple of things. One relates to what you were just talking about, storytelling. I teach, in addition to leadership storytelling. In fact, I was doing a storytelling workshop with a group of CEOs, and the CEO said, "Oh, I hate storytelling. I'm terrible at storytelling." And I said, "Well, why do you say that?" He said, "Well, let me tell you what happened one time." And he told this amazing story, right? So we're all natural storytellers. Kids tell stories. If someone says, "How was work today?" "Oh, you wouldn't believe what happened to me today." You're telling a story, right? So remove that I can't tell a story and I can't draw a thing from your vocabulary, right? Another thing is, be, as a leader, don't only work on your storytelling, work on your story listening, right?
Yes.
Everyone has a story. So if you could pull that out of people, it makes you a more empathetic and knowledgeable leader, right? And also, as you can see, there's an eye on the cover of my book, and the focus is on, as a leader, how do you get your vision out there into the world?
Yes.
But turn it around and say, can I see things from other people's point of view? And I think with what's going on in the world right now, it's more important than ever, in the spirit of diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity, to be able to see, put yourself in the shoes of others, like in To Kill a Mockingbird, right? And also see things, see the world through the eyes of others, right? It'll make us more empathetic, more knowledgeable, and better leaders in a variety of different ways.
And I think you'll also find it a much more interesting place. Assume nothing.
Yeah.
Don't sit in your office and imagine what's going on. And people say, what does an anthropologist do? I say, we hang out. And as you hang out, you begin to hear people tell their stories. You'll be amazed how fast they will tell you. Spend a day in the life of a client and learn what really matters to them, not what they tell you in a formal situation. But life is very interesting and it's exciting.
Yeah.
So I've had Todd Cherches here with us today. He's got a new book, Visual Leadership, but he's also a real pro in helping you see, feel, and think in new ways. Thank you, Todd, for joining me.
Andy, it was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I forgot to tell them, how can they find you and how can they find your book?
Yeah, the best way to find the book is on any bookseller online. Hopefully it'll be in bookstores at some point when there are bookstores open again, but just go to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere online, Visual Leadership, one word, or you can just look up my name, Todd Cherches, Cherches. And the best way by far to connect with me is just on LinkedIn. If you connect with me on LinkedIn, I'll accept your invitation. I'll be able to see who you are, and we'll have a new connection and could start a conversation.
And I have a hunch you're going to have fun because I think that Todd has great stories to share and each one of them makes me smile. So it's been a lovely time sharing. For those of you who join us, I can't thank you enough. We've been ranked in the top 20 futurist podcasts, and we're off and on in the top 200 business ones for entrepreneurship. It's always an honor. Thank you for joining, and also thank you for sending us your ideas. Many of you have been sending me new people you want me to interview. It's fun. Keep sharing them away and enjoy. Please stay safe, please healthy, and love thy neighbor. It's a great time to remember that. Bye-bye now.